Little Trump Girl was cast out of church by leftist youth leader, but a WWII veteran rushed in and said, "Subscribe to the channel right now to find out the end of this epic story and comment below which part of this great America you are watching from." That Sunday morning dawned with a promise of golden redemption, as sunbeams pierced through leaden clouds to strike directly upon the century-old stained glass of Oak Creek Community Church. Outside, the world seemed to spin at its frantic, chaotic pace, divided by digital screaming matches and culture wars. But in here, between the stone walls and the solid oak pews polished by generations of the faithful, absolute peace was supposed to reign. Supposed to. But for Emma, a girl of just 14, whose soul vibrated with an ancient purity, the air inside the sanctuary felt thinner than usual, heavy with a static electricity that made the hair on her arms stand up, not from cold, but from a dark premonition. Emma was the embodiment of an America that many said was disappearing, yet in her heart it burned like an eternal flame. She was, in the purest and most vulnerable definition of the term, a little MAGA girl, not out of hate, not out of political complexity, but out of love. She loved the land where she was born. She loved the stories her grandfather told about sacrifice and honor, and she loved God above all else. That day, she had chosen her favorite dress, a soft yellow fabric, modest, falling to her knees, evoking the simplicity of gentler times. A pink ribbon held back her wavy blonde hair, and in her arms, clutched tight against her chest as if it were the only anchor in a stormy sea, was her worn, black leather Bible. However, the detail that defined her identity and tragically painted the target on her back was small, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but screamingly obvious to eyes trained in modern intolerance. Pinned to the lace collar of her dress shone a small enamel pin of the United States flag, and stuck to the cover of her Bible study notebook was a sticker with unmistakable gold letters, MAGA. To Emma, that meant safety, strong borders, and happy families. To the new regime that had silently installed itself in the church's youth leadership, it was a thought crime. Oak Creek Church had always been her refuge, but things had changed drastically in recent months. The old youth pastor, a gentleman who taught forgiveness and charity, had retired. In his place came Jason. Jason's simple presence altered the chemical balance of the room. He didn't walk with the reverence the place demanded. He marched. He didn't wear the Sunday suit that signaled respect for the congregation. He wore the uniform of his own culture war. Emma, sitting alone in one of the wooden pews in the third row, tried to make herself small. She hunched her shoulders, keeping her eyes down, focused on the gold lettering of her Bible, but her peripheral vision was on high alert. She could feel his presence before she even saw him. The scent of incense and candle wax seemed to be sliced through by an aura of latent aggression. Jason was at the back of the center aisle, talking to a group of teenagers who, under his tutelage, had traded spiritual curiosity for political cynicism. The youth leader, a college student in his early 20s with a permanent scowl of disapproval, wore a tight black t-shirt. On his chest, there was no cross, but a collection of colorful buttons with radical leftist slogans, symbols of causes he preached with more fervor than any gospel. He was the living image of the militant leftist, articulate, furious, and armed with an academic vocabulary designed to dismantle the self-esteem of anyone who dared disagree. Emma knew she wasn't welcome in that new circle. In the weeks prior, she had noticed the side glances, the whispers when she passed, the stifled snickers when she suggested praying for the nation during study groups. She felt the cold loneliness of isolation. Her childhood friends, influenced by Jason's inflammatory rhetoric, had started to pull away, afraid of being associated with the reactionary girl. The pain of this abandonment was an open wound in her chest, but she refused to take off the pin. She refused to hide who she was. It was a quiet bravery, typical of those who do not seek the fight, but do not run when cornered. Systemic oppression is everywhere. Jason's voice echoed, cutting through the soft murmur of pre-service prayers. He wasn't whispering, he was performing. He spoke to be heard, to establish dominance. Emma shuddered. She knew his speech about tolerance always came loaded with exceptions, and she was the exception. The sunlight shifted angles, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and for a brief moment, the American flag pin on Emma's dress caught the light, emitting a silver gleam. It was enough. Like a predator drawn to movement, Jason's head snapped around. His eyes, behind thick-rimmed glasses, locked onto the lonely girl in the yellow dress. There was no compassion in that gaze, only the cold recognition of an ideological enemy. Emma felt the weight of that stare. Her heart began to beat out of rhythm, a frantic drum against her ribs. "Please, no," she begged God silently. "Please, just let me watch the service. Let me be in peace." Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the cover of her Bible, seeking texture, seeking reality, trying not to cry before the first word was even spoken. She remembered what her father had told her. "The world is getting hard for people like us, honey. They're going to try to make you feel ashamed, but the shame isn't yours." She repeated those words like a mantra, but in that moment, facing the imminence of confrontation, she felt like just a small child before a furious giant. Jason broke away from his group of acolytes. He didn't walk toward the altar, he walked toward her. Every step he took on the wooden floor creaked like a countdown. The atmosphere in the church shifted instantly. The other youths, realizing their leader's direction, stopped talking and watched. There was a morbid curiosity in the air, the cruel anticipation of a public spectacle. The church, God's house, was about to become an ideological tribunal. Emma sank into the pew, wishing the wood would swallow her whole. She was the picture of vulnerability, the childish pink ribbon, contrasting violently with the dark, threatening aura approaching her. She was unarmed, alone, and surrounded by a complicit silence. No one moved to intercept Jason. The adults were in other parts of the building or distracted. The sanctuary belonged in that moment to the radicalized youth. When Jason stopped at the edge of the row where Emma sat, he didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, hovering, blocking the light, his shadow casting long over her yellow dress. He crossed his arms, the black t-shirt stretching over a chest covered in slogans, and let out an audible sigh, loaded with contempt and impatience. "I thought I made myself clear last week, Emma." His voice was low, a dangerous hiss that carried more venom than a scream, "about the kind of environment we are building here, a safe space." Emma looked up, eyes welling with fear, meeting Jason's face. She saw the rigidity in his jaw, the fanaticism in his eyes. She tried to speak, but her throat was closed tight, dry with panic. I just came for the service, Jason," she whispered, her voice cracking, barely audible. "The service is for the community," Jason retorted, raising his volume slightly, ensuring the others heard. He took a step into the row, invading her personal space. "And symbols of hate have no place in this community." His finger pointed, accusatory and trembling with contained rage, not at her, but at the small flag pin and the sticker on her notebook. To Emma, they were symbols of love. To Jason, they were triggers for a doctrinaire fury. The injustice of that accusation made a solitary tear roll down Emma's cheek. She was being judged not for what she did, but for what she represented. There, in the church pew, the little MAGA girl was completely exposed. The system, represented by Jason's arrogance, was about to crash down on her with the full weight of its intolerance, disguised as virtue. She had nowhere to run. Paralyzing fear took over her limbs. She hugged the Bible tighter, knuckles white, waiting for the verbal blow, waiting for the humiliation, feeling like the loneliest person in the world in a place that should be full of love. The storm had arrived, and she had no shelter. The tense silence hanging over the church was shattered not by thunder, but by Jason's vocal explosion. The activists' pretended calm evaporated the instant Emma tried to stammer a defense. To him, the mere existence of a dissenting voice, no matter how soft and shaky, was an unbearable provocation. "You just came for the service." Jason repeated her phrase with acidic sarcasm, twisting the words as if they were a personal insult. "Is that your excuse? Convenient ignorance?" He took another step forward, breaking the last barrier of personal space remaining between him and the girl. Now, he was dangerously close, looming over her like a black tower of judgment. The smell of strong coffee and the aura of anger radiated from him in suffocating waves. Emma shrank physically, pressing her back against the hard wood of the pew, her blue eyes wide with terror, fixed on the contorted face of her aggressor. "Don't play innocent, Emma!" Jason yelled, and the sound reverberated off the stone walls of the chapel, startling pigeons resting on the eaves outside. "You know exactly what that pin represents. You know what that MAGA sticker screams to the oppressed minorities we are trying to welcome here. You are turning this safe space into a battlefield with your fascist propaganda." The word fascist hit Emma like a physical slap. She barely understood the complex political concept he spat with such ease, but she felt the weight of the hate embedded in the accusation. It's just our country's flag, Jason," Emma sobbed, tears finally overflowing and running free down her flushed face. Her voice was thin, brittle, the sound of a childhood being forced to grow up too fast under the pressure of adult cruelty. "My grandpa fought for it. I love America." "Your love is toxic," Jason roared, interrupting her violently. He seemed energized by her crying, fed by the display of weakness. He spun on his heels, opening his arms to the small audience of teenagers watching, petrified, turning the bullying into an impromptu political rally. "Look at this," he pointed at the cowering girl. "This is what privilege does. She cries when confronted with the truth. She uses love of country as a shield for white nationalism, for exclusion, for systemic hate. And when we, the true warriors of social justice, ask for accountability, she plays the victim." The other teenagers, confused and intimidated by their leader's fury, remained silent. Some looked away, ashamed, feeling in their guts that this was wrong, very wrong. But the fear of being Jason's next target, the fear of being labeled with those terrible words he used, racist, bigot, fascist, kept them paralyzed. Their silence was the validation Jason needed. He felt like the judge, jury, and moral executioner of that sanctuary. He turned his attention back to Emma, his eyes gleaming with a manic fanaticism. He saw her small hand trying to cover the flag pin, an instinctive gesture of protection. That enraged him even further. "Take it off," he ordered, his voice dropping to a guttural, threatening tone. Emma blinked, tears blurring her vision. What? "I said take it off," Jason bellowed, slamming his hand hard onto the back of the pew in front of Emma. The crash made the girl jump in fright, a muffled cry escaping her lips. "You will not wear those symbols of hate in my church. You will not flaunt that rotten ideology in front of me. Take that pin off and throw that notebook in the trash right now, or get out of here and never come back." The injustice of the situation was overwhelming. Emma looked around, desperately seeking a friendly face, an adult, anyone to say this was madness. But she saw only shadows and lowered eyes. She was alone, completely, devastatingly alone. The feeling of abandonment was more painful than the shouting. The place where she was baptized, where she learned to sing "Jesus loves me," had become a cold prison of political dogmas. Please, Jason, she pleaded, her voice choked by compulsive sobbing. God loves us all. Why are you yelling at me? Don't use God to justify your intolerance. He spat the words, face red, neck veins bulging. He extended his arm, index finger pointed inches from Emma's nose, like a cocked weapon. You and your family represent everything wrong with the world. You are the past we need to burn down to build the future. You are a disgrace to this generation. Every sentence was a hammer blow. Emma felt herself diminishing, as if disappearing under the torrent of verbal aggression. She hugged the Bible so hard her arms ached, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to block out the image of Jason's twisted face. She began to pray softly, a childish and desperate prayer, asking for help, asking for strength, asking for it to stop. "Don't ignore me!" Jason screamed, realizing she was praying. Her piety seemed to offend him even more. He grabbed the edge of the pew where she sat and shook it slightly, a display of physical force designed to terrorize. Your hypocritical faith won't save you here. The only salvation is deconstruction. You need to admit your privileges. Admit you are part of the problem. Despair reached its peak. Emma couldn't breathe right anymore. Air came in short, painful hiccups. The world was spinning. She felt she was being crushed by a colossal ideological force against which her innocence had no defense. She was just a girl who loved her country, and now she was being treated like a war criminal by a man twice her age and size. Jason, seeing the broken girl, weeping uncontrollably, felt the triumph of power. He interpreted her tears not as human suffering, but as the surrender of the enemy. He puffed out his chest, feeling like a hero in his own twisted narrative. "Last chance, MAGA girl," he hissed, cruelty dripping from every syllable. He held out his open hand, palm demanding, facing her. "Give me the pin. Give me the notebook. Renounce that patriotic filth right now in front of everyone, or I will drag you out of this church myself." The physical threat hung in the air, heavy and real. Emma looked at Jason's outstretched hand, then at the pin on her chest. That little piece of metal represented everything she admired in her father and grandfather. Handing it over would be betraying who she was, but fear was a devouring monster. She was cornered, humiliated, and terrified. The leftist had beaten down the resistance of her mind, but her heart still clung desperately to the truth. Yet her hands shook so much she could barely move. The moment of final humiliation was set. Jason smiled, a cold, joyless smile, knowing he had broken her. No one breathed in the church. Time seemed to have stopped at the exact instant of the greatest cowardice. The darkness of ideological tyranny had swallowed the light of that Sunday, and Emma, the little patriot, was about to be sacrificed on the altar of radicalism. Jason's hand hovered in the air like a vulture's claw, fingers curled with tension and the certainty of impunity, mere inches from Emma's chest. The air in the chapel was stagnant, choked by the malice of the moment. Emma, eyes closed and face bathed in hot tears, cringed, waiting for the violent yank that would rip away the symbol of her patriotism, and with it, the last shred of her dignity. The leftist grinned, savoring the submission, about to commit the final act of desecration against the girl's innocence. But the touch never came. Instead, a new sound cut through the oppressive silence of the church. It wasn't a scream nor thunder, but something rhythmic, heavy, and terribly solemn. Thud. Step. Thud. Step. The dry sound of wood striking the old floorboards echoed with the authority of a judge's gavel. It was a sound that demanded attention, a sound that carried historical weight. Jason froze, hands suspended in the air, brow furrowed in confusion and irritation at having his teaching moment interrupted. He turned his head slowly toward the sanctuary entrance, just like all the other paralyzed youths. There, silhouetted against the bright white light streaming through the open narthex doors, was a figure that seemed to have stepped out of another era. The figure advanced into the gloom of the nave, and the details revealed themselves with striking clarity. It was Major Arthur. At 92 years old, the old soldier's body no longer possessed the athletic vitality of youth, but it radiated a tectonic strength forged in fire and steel. He wasn't wearing civilian clothes. That day, for reasons only God and Providence knew, Arthur had donned his full-dress uniform of the United States Army, preserved immaculately for decades. The olive-drab fabric was perfectly pressed, trouser creases sharp as razors, brass buttons shone like little stars. But what stole the breath away were the medals. Rows upon rows of colorful ribbons and metals hung over the left side of his chest. Bronze stars, purple hearts, campaign insignias from Europe and the Pacific. They jingled softly with every movement, a metallic music that sang of sacrifice, blood, and glory. Arthur walked with difficulty, leaning on a dark walnut cane, but his posture was erect, defying gravity and age. His face, a geographic map of deep wrinkles and sun-weathered skin, was set in an expression of icy, controlled fury. His grey eyes, which had witnessed the horrors of Omaha Beach and the liberation of concentration camps, did not blink. They were locked on Jason like sniper scopes. "Step away from her!" Arthur's voice rumbled. It wasn't a hysterical scream like Jason's. It was a battlefield command. Low, gravelly, vibrating with an authority not learned in universities, but earned in the trenches. Jason, caught off guard, blinked, trying to process the interruption. The sight of the uniform, the aura of real power emanating from the elderly man, made the activist instinctively take a step back. But Jason's arrogance was thick armor. He recovered his defiant posture, adjusting his glasses, trying to reassert his dominance. "Who are you?" Jason scoffed, though his voice had lost its earlier firmness. He looked the old man up and down with disdain. "We are in the middle of an educational session here. This is a space for youth, Gramps. You are interrupting progress." Arthur didn't stop. He continued his slow, inexorable march down the center aisle. Thud, step, thud, step. Every strike of the cane seemed to diminish Jason's size. "I said," Arthur repeated, now just a few yards away, his voice growing in volume and intensity, "Step away from the child." The order exploded in the air. The echo made Jason physically falter. Major Arthur reached the pew where Emma was huddled. With a movement that ignored the pain in his joints, the veteran placed himself physically between the aggressor and the victim. He transformed into a human shield, a wall of honor, blocking Jason's view of the girl. Arthur turned to Jason, drawing himself up to his full height. Up close, the veteran's presence was overwhelming. He smelled of old shaving lotion, tobacco, and ironclad dignity. "You speak of progress?" Arthur said, his eyes piercing the activist's shallow soul. "I see only cowardice. I see a grown man terrorizing a helpless little girl. Is this your future? Is this your justice?" Jason felt his face burn. He wasn't used to being challenged, much less by someone he considered an obsolete relic. "You don't understand anything," Jason spat, pointing his finger now at Arthur's medal-laden chest. "You are a symbol of imperialism. These medals are badges of oppression. You heroes destroyed the world we are trying to fix. That girl is spreading the hate that you helped create." The tension reached the breaking point. The youths in the pews held their breath. Jason had crossed the final line. He had insulted the veterans' service. Arthur's hand moved with surprising speed. He didn't hit Jason, but his cane came up in a blur, the tip stopping a millimeter from the activist's chest, pushing him lightly, enough to off-balance him. Jason stumbled back, startled by the physical reaction. "Shut your filthy mouth, son," Arthur growled, righteous fury spilling over. "Oppression? You dare use that word in front of me? I saw real oppression. I saw piles of skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood by regimes that preached exactly what you preach: blind obedience to the state and hatred of the individual." Arthur took a step forward, forcing Jason to retreat again. The leftist was shrinking. his bravado melting before the heat of historical truth. This flag... Arthur lightly touched one of his insignias and then pointed to the pin on Emma's dress, without looking back, protecting her. This flag isn't about hate. It's about the blood of my friends. Friends who died screaming for their mothers in the cold sand, 18-year-old boys, younger than you, who gave their lives so an ungrateful, spoiled brat like you could have the freedom to stand in a heated church, wearing that ridiculous T-shirt and spouting nonsense without being dragged to a firing squad. The veteran's voice cracked, choked by the raw emotion of memory, but soon regained the strength of steel. You want to take her pin? You'll have to go through me. You'll have to rip these medals off my cold chest first, because as long as I draw breath, no one, and I mean no one, will intimidate a patriot in this house of God. The silence that followed was absolute. Jason looked around, seeking support, but found only the gazes of the teenagers, and in their eyes he no longer saw fear. He saw admiration. For the old soldier, Jason's narrative had been destroyed. He tried to formulate an academic response, something about cisgender privilege or patriarchy, but the words died in his throat. They seemed hollow, ridiculous in the face of the reality of flesh, bone, and sacrifice standing before him. He had been morally eviscerated in public, defeated. Jason tried to salvage some fragment of dignity with a bureaucratic threat, the only weapon he had left. This is assault," he stammered, backing away toward the center aisle, hands trembling. "You can't threaten me. I'll report this. I'm going to expose this church on social media. You'll be cancelled. The board will hear about this. You'll see. You'll regret protecting fascists." "Go," Arthur thundered, pointing his cane at the exit like an unsheathed sword. "Take your threats and your poisonous ideology far away from here. Get out." Jason, pale and shaking, spun around and marched hurriedly to the exit, almost running, stumbling on the carpet, a pathetic figure fleeing the light of truth. The church door slammed behind him with a final bang, sealing his defeat. The atmosphere in the church changed instantly. The suffocating pressure vanished, replaced by clean, light air. Arthur stood motionless for a moment, catching his breath, chest heaving heavily, hand gripping the cane tight. Slowly, the warrior turned. The expression of a furious lion disappeared, giving way to the gentle face of a loving grandfather. He looked down at little Emma, who was still curled up in the pew, clutching her Bible, looking at him with wide eyes of astonishment and gratitude, as if she had just seen an avenging angel. Arthur rested his cane on the pew, groaned softly with the pain in his knees, and bent down to be at her eye level. With one of his large, calloused hands, he pulled an immaculate white linen handkerchief from his pocket and held it out to her. "It's all right now, little one," he whispered, his raspy voice now soft as velvet. "The enemy has retreated. The perimeter is secure." Emma took the handkerchief, hands shaking, and wiped her face. She looked at the flag pin on her chest, then at his medals. "Thank you," she sobbed, voice weak. I was so scared. He said I was bad." "He lied," Arthur said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. The weight of his hand was comforting, an anchor of safety. "You aren't bad. You are brave. You held your position when you were under heavy fire alone. That's what soldiers do. That's what Americans do." Despite the comfort, the sound of distant sirens or the buzz of phones being picked up by the other youths was a reminder that the culture war outside the church walls continued. Jason was gone, but the institutional threat, the fear of cancellation he promised, still hung like a cloud on the horizon. But there, on that wooden bench under the protection of the old soldier, the little MAGA girl took a deep breath for the first time that morning, feeling that perhaps justice was still possible. The boom of the door closing behind Jason still echoed in the auditory memory of the congregation, But the air inside Oak Creek Community Church began to change. It was as if a violent storm had suddenly dissipated, leaving behind the smell of ozone and the crystal clarity that only exists after the rain. The fear, that toxic mist the activist had spread with his words of division and hate, evaporated before the solid, immutable presence of Major Arthur. Emma still held the veteran's white linen handkerchief, pressing the soft fabric against her face. Her tears had ceased, replaced by deep, shaky breathing. She looked up at the old soldier's face. His wrinkles, previously contorted in righteous fury, now softened into a smile of paternal benevolence. He no longer seemed just an intimidating historical figure. He seemed the very embodiment of safety, a rock amidst the quicksand of modernity. "Stand up, soldier," Arthur said gently, extending his hand. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation to dignity. Emma hesitated for a second, looking at the other youths around. They were static, as if waking from a collective trance. Jason's humiliating exit had broken the spell. Without the radical leader to dictate who should be hated and who should be cancelled, the natural humanity of those teenagers began to resurface. They looked at Emma no longer with induced contempt, but with shame. Shame for having allowed her to stand alone. Shame for having traded Christian compassion for political fanaticism. With the help of Arthur's steady hand, Emma stood up. Her legs were still weak, but her spine straightened. She smoothed her yellow dress, and her hand instinctively grazed the American flag pin. It was still there. She hadn't surrendered it. She had won. It was in that moment that the silence was broken again, this time by calm footsteps coming from the side vestry. Reverend Thomas, a man with graying hair and a serene gaze, walked to the center of the aisle. He had arrived in time to hear the final confrontation, witnessing Jason's cowardice and Arthur's bravery. The pastor stopped beside the veteran and the girl, looking at the door through which the leftist had fled. "There will be no cancelling here." Pastor Thomas's voice rang out firm, resonating with a spiritual authority Jason could never comprehend. He looked at the youths in the pews. "This church does not bow to social media threats. We do not serve the tyranny of popular opinion. We serve the truth. And the truth is that today a child was persecuted in my house for loving her country and her faith. And this ends now." The pastor turned to Emma. His eyes were full of sorrow, but also pride. "Emma, I am so sorry we allowed such darkness to enter our midst under the guise of youth leadership. Jason will not be coming back. If he or anyone else wants to attack the values that founded this nation and this church, they will find the doors locked to their hate." A wave of relief washed over Emma's body. The institutional threat, the fear of being expelled from her community, vanished. Justice wasn't just an abstract concept defended by the veteran, it was being restored in practice. Arthur, leaning on his cane, nodded gravely to the pastor, an acknowledgement between men of duty. Then he turned his attention back to the girl. He reached into the inner pocket of his military jacket and pulled out something small and metallic. It was an antique pin, slightly worn by time, featuring the American eagle clutching arrows and an olive branch. "Emma," Arthur said, his voice choked with emotion. "In war, when a soldier demonstrated exceptional bravery under enemy fire, we recognize them. You didn't retreat. You held your ground when the world screamed for you to give up." He fastened the small badge to the collar of her dress, right above the flag pin she already wore. "This belonged to my wife," he revealed, eyes shining. "She worked in the factories while I was in Europe. She fought here, keeping the flame of freedom lit, just as you did today. Wear this with pride. You are a little MAGA girl, yes, but you are more than that. You are the future of America. And as long as there are young people like you, who aren't afraid to love God and country, all the sacrifice of my generation will have been worth it." Emma touched the new pin, feeling the cold metal against her skin, but an immense warmth in her heart. She no longer felt like a victim. The pain of humiliation had been transmuted into a new, unbreakable strength. She looked at Arthur and, for the first time that day, her smile was full, radiant, and genuine. "Thank you, Major," she said, her voice now clear and strong. "I promise I will never stop loving our country." The moment of triumph rippled through the room. One of the boys sitting in the front row, one who had laughed at Jason's jokes earlier, stood up shyly. "Emma," he started, looking at the floor. "Sorry, the Major is right. We were stupid." One by one, the other youths began to nod, murmurs of apology filling the air. The artificial ideological division Jason had built crumbled before the reality of forgiveness and honor. Arthur offered his arm to Emma. "Come, my dear. The sun is shining outside, and I think we both deserve a little fresh air away from these shadows." Emma linked her small arm through the veteran's strong, uniformed arm. Together, they began to walk down the center aisle toward the exit. The sound of Arthur's cane, thud, step, thud, step, now sounded like a victory march. As they passed the pews, the congregation, which was starting to arrive for the main service and had heard the account of what happened, began to stand. There were no euphoric shouts, but a deep, silent respect, and then someone started to clap. Slowly at first, but soon the sound grew. Strong, decisive applause. It was the sound of a community reaffirming its values. Upon reaching the great oak doors of the church, the midday sunlight flooded the vestibule, bathing Emma and Arthur in a golden glow. The image was powerful and symbolic. The old warrior, bent by the weight of history, and the young girl, standing tall with the promise of the future, united inseparably. The past had protected the present to ensure the future. Outside, the breeze stirred the large American flag hoisted on the pole in the church courtyard. The red and white stripes and the stars on the blue background danced against the clear sky, free, proud, and beautiful. Emma looked at the flag and then at Major Arthur. She knew the world outside would still be difficult. She knew there would be other Jasons, other keyboard tyrants and furious ideologues, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had history on her side. She had the truth in her heart. And she knew, with the absolute certainty of faith, that justice and freedom would always prevail as long as there was courage to defend them. The little MAGA girl had entered the church as a frightened girl, but she left as a formed patriot, ready to carry the torch of freedom to the next generation. The victory belonged to traditional values. The victory belonged to love. And above all, the victory belonged to America.